All right, let's just jump right in. When you and I think about the summer of 1787, we get this mental picture, right? The founding fathers in this pristine, almost mythological version of Philadelphia. But here's the thing. That picture, it's a little too clean, a little too perfect. So today, we're going to strip away that glossy varnish of history. We're going to piece together what that famous city actually looked, felt, and yeah, even smelled like.
So that brings us to the big question. What was it really like to be there? What was the actual sensory experience of Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention? The answer, I think, is going to surprise you. Because that common image we all have in our heads, the one from paintings and movies, is in a lot of ways just plain wrong. Let's start with the most famous building of them all, Independence Hall. You're picturing it with that huge grand steeple, aren't you? Well, in 1787, it wasn't there. The original wooden steeple had rotted out and was torn down 6 years earlier. So the building the delegates actually saw had a much shorter brick tower with this simple kind of squat-hipped roof. That famous steeple we all know? It wasn't rebuilt until 1828. Just that one detail completely changes the skyline of our historical imagination.
To build a more honest picture of the city, we have to start from the ground up. Literally. So let's talk about the very surfaces the founders walked and rode on every single day.
You know, the whole texture of the city was defined by its basic materials. The bricks weren't the perfectly uniform machine-made blocks we have now. No, they were molded by hand, so every single one had its own little quirks in size and color. And the streets? Mostly paved with cobblestones, which were literally just rounded stones dredged up from local riverbeds. Nothing was perfectly flat or even.
And if you were to look closely at the fancy buildings, like Independence Hall, you'd notice this really specific brick pattern. It's called Flemish Bond. It's this elegant design where they alternate the long side of a red brick, that's the stretcher, with the short, dark end of a black brick, the header. It might seem like a small detail, but back then, that pattern was a huge visual signal of wealth and importance.
So what did it feel like to get around on this stuff? Well, forget smooth asphalt. The main streets were covered in those rounded cobblestones. Any carriage with iron-rimmed wheels rolling over them would have produced this constant, jarring, high-frequency vibration. We're talking teeth-rattling stuff. Then on the side streets, you were just dealing with dirt and gravel, which meant deep ruts, thick, gooey mud whenever it rained, and just clouds of choking dust when it was dry. Okay, so if the streets were that rough, how did anyone get around without, losing their teeth? Well, that brings us to the totally fascinating mechanics of 18th century transportation. The big innovation was a pretty clever piece of tech called the thorough brace. Instead of steel springs, carriages were basically suspended on these thick leather straps. The best way to picture it is to imagine the body of the carriage just resting in a big leather cradle. Now, this system didn't jolt you up and down. Instead, it absorbed the shocks by swaying and pitching, a low-frequency rocking motion that, as you can imagine, made a lot of people feel pretty seasick. And that swaying motion was different depending on what you were riding in. A heavy, four-wheeled coach, that was your most stable option, a total status symbol. But the two-wheeled chase was way more common, and it had this really pronounced forward and backward pitch. And then you have the owner-driven phaeton, which was basically the fun, informal sports car of its day. And here's a fantastic piece of trivia for you. The sulky, that's the lightweight carriage for just one person, it got its name because it was invented by a doctor who was sick and tired of having to give people rides while he was on his rounds. His friends, who were pretty annoyed that he didn't have room for them anymore, mockingly called his little one-seater a sulky. And, well, the name just stuck. Okay, let's shift our focus from day to night. Because after dark, Philadelphia had this revolutionary advantage, something no other American city could even come close to. The whole story kicks off in 1751. That's the year Philadelphia became the very first city in America to install a system of public street lighting. I mean, that was a massive, massive leap into the modern world. But this wasn't just any old lighting system. It was a classic example of Benjamin Franklin's practical genius. See, London street lamps were these sealed glass globes that would just trap smoke and get completely caked in soot within a few hours. Franklin designed a simple, four-sided lantern with an open top and bottom. This created an updraft that let the smoke escape, which kept the glass panes clear and the light bright. It was such a simple, brilliant fix. So what was fueling these lamps? Whale oil. And that created a completely unique sensory world. Whale oil light wasn't a steady, white glow like we're used to. It was a flickering, honey yellow kind of haze. People back then described it as a light that was more suggestive than real, something that cast these long, deep shadows. And it came with a smell, a very distinct, pungent, fishy smell that would have just filled the night air.
So we have the vibrating ground, the swaying carriages, and the flickering, fishy-smelling night. It's time to add our final layer, the very air that the founders were breathing. You have to remember, Philadelphia in 1787 was a city powered by burning things, mostly wood and coal. Every single home had chimneys for heating and cooking, and they were constantly pumping smoke into the atmosphere. When all that smoke mixed with the natural humidity coming off the Delaware River, it created this thick, persistent urban smog. And we're not talking about a light morning haze, no. This air had color and texture. People wrote about how the fog could shift from an ashen gray in the morning to a kind of yellowish, and then finally to a sooty brownish black by evening. They were literally breathing in particulates all day long. And this pollution didn't just stay in the air. It landed on everything. You have to imagine this fine, kind of greasy black drizzle of soot constantly settling on the marble trim of Independence Hall, on the polished doors of a fancy carriage, on the dark wool coats of the delegates themselves. This was a grimy, soot-stained world. So let's put it all together. To truly see 1787, you have to rebuild it with all your senses. First, picture that altered skyline with no steeple on Independence Hall. Then feel the constant rattle of the cobblestones and that queasy, seasick sway of your carriage. See the night, not as pitch black, but through this flickering, yellow-hued filter. And finally, take a deep breath of that air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and whale oil. And that brings me to a final thought. When we really understand the harsh, uncomfortable, and frankly distracting physical reality that these delegates were living in, the vibrating roads, the oppressive smog, the constant grime, it makes the monumental focus and the incredible intellectual clarity they achieved inside Independence Hall that summer seem all the more astonishing, doesn't it?